get a solid, clear definition of two terms that are thrown out a lot in reference to our status in Eretz Yisrael today. So one term that is used a lot is that the Jewish people are now sovereign once again. It's a very, very common term used to describe the existence of the state of Israel. I'm going to focus on that first, and then the second part is going to focus more on the notion of what makes Eretz Yisrael superior, which is another concept that exists, that there's a certain inherent superiority to the land of Israel. What's the first thing I'm going to read, following the sheets. So if everyone knows Rav Soloveitchik Zatzal was a huge proponent of Eretz Yisrael in plenty of writings, in Kol Gidul Fake, numerous speeches, etc. He speaks about the importance of religious Zionism, of the return of many Jews of Bnei Yisrael to Eretz Yisrael, and the impact it had on Jewry as a whole. If I'm not mistaken, he says in one spot that the most defining event for the history of the Jews in the past few hundred years, can you argue more than that, has been the founding of the state of Israel. It unified Jews in an unbelievable way. But it's amazing, in a lecture he gave in Boston to his Baal Batim in 1974, he says the following. It's right in the sheet. He says, he was speaking about Kiddush Levana. He says, Kiddush Levana is symbolic of the historical, I apologize for the typo, historical destiny of the Jews. Despite the fact that we've been absent from the historical arena for a long time, we will return. Actually, we have not taken part in historical events and historical developments for the last 1900 years. We have not reappeared as yet. So it's amazing. The Rav wanted to say that our state of Gullus, by definition, meant that we were kind of erased from history to some extent. We were there, but our impact was never that recognized. Then he says like this. He says, if you think the state of Israel, now you have to understand, the Rav, huge supporter of, he was even offered the job to become chief rabbi. If you think the state of Israel means the reappearance of the Jew in the historical arena, then you are mistaken. If a Kissinger, referring to the former Secretary of State, can give an order to the foreign minister or the prime minister of Eretz Yisrael to come in September instead of November, then there's no real Jewish sovereignty. That was an order. It was not an invitation. Under such circumstances, and this is the Rav, under such circumstances, there's no real independence, no real sovereignty. With the arrival of Mashiach, the Jewish people will reappear. And then he concludes, we've disappeared not just for a short time while, but for a very long time. Suddenly, when no one expects us to do so, we will appear in full glory, in full glamour, in full splendor, the way the new moon reappears. What's amazing, the astonishing statement, the Rav wants to say that our notion of sovereignty is really an illusion, that we think we're actually sovereign people at this point, at least if you take him literally. But I think there was a certain idea the Rav was trying to get across, and that's what I want to spend a few minutes discussing. So if you look, we use the term shir and shira are used interchangeably quite often in Tanakh. All right. For example, source number 2, Az Yashir Moshe Bnei Yisrael Es Hashira Hazos. So shira being the feminine, and many times we'll see that that's how the term is used. But if you look at number 3, there are other times, for instance, Tehillim, where it says Mizmor Shiru LaHashem Shir Chadash. So of course, on a surface level, who cares? In other words, maybe you could just argue that based on whatever grammatical context the words being used, that's why it's Zachar o Nekeva. However, there's a fascinating medrash that actually challenges this notion. The medrash is in number 4, it's in Shir Shirim, and it says that basically, Rabbi Rachia B'Shem Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman Amar, so he says, Bnei Yisrael, there's two analysis here. The first one he says is that Bnei Yisrael compared to a woman. Okay, how so? A woman, all right, she's notelas Isur Nechasim Avia V'yotza. So upon her father's death, she's entitled to 1/10 of his possessions. Kach Yarshu Yisrael Eretz Shiva Alamim Shehu Isur Shivim Umos. So too, okay, the Jews. Now he's referring to from the Exodus through the initial conquering of the of Eretz Yisrael, where we wiped out the 7 nations. So too, we wiped out 7, but we wiped out 7 of the 70. In other words, the common notion is that there are 70 umos olam. We were obligated to wipe out 7 of those 70. That equals 1/10 of the umos olam. A little violent, but yes, only 1/10 to be accomplished. And therefore, as a result, that's like the woman who inherits 1/10. Thus, as the Medrash explains, that's why the Aidesh Yirshu Yisrael can nekeva amru shira v'lashon nekeva. So therefore, that's why it says shira. The feminine term is used to reflect Bnei Yisrael in that state, okay? And that's why it says, Az Yashir Moshe. That was in the, we'll call it for now, the first Geula, the Exodus from Egypt through the final Kibush Aretz. Then a Medrash says, Aval Asud Lavo, later on, All right, Hein Asidin Liresh Kizahar in the future, okay, alluding to the Yemos Mashiach, to the final Geula, we will be Yoresh like a male. All right, because why? Because a male, he inherits everything from his father, all his possessions. All right, and he says, and he quotes a pasuk in Chesed to prove that. And he says, therefore, that's why, but therefore, what's the implication? The implication is that all 70 of the nations will be eradicated, so to speak. We'll explain what that means in a second. All 70 nations will cease to exist in the times of the Geula. Therefore, it's complete. And therefore, as he says, therefore the Lashon is now Shir. So when it says, Mizmor Shiru La Hashem Shir Chadash, David Melech is alluding to Yemos Mashiach, the times of Mashiach. Okay? So the Medrash is telling you that the fact that we use the term Shira versus Shir, that back and forth actually has a profound difference. It doesn't work in every situation, by the way, I tested it, but fairly often, when the word Shira is used, that's referencing Bnei Yisrael let's say, Geula Acharona, and then when the term Shir is used, that's in reference to the Yemos Mashiach. We have to understand what idea is the Medrash trying to express us. It's a very cryptic Medrash. I mean, so therefore what? And what's the difference between the fact that we wiped out 7 versus 70? And also, are we really supposed to believe in Yemos Mashiach that basically the entire non-Jewish world is going to be eradicated and all that's going to be left are the Jewish people? Clearly it's not the case. So we need to understand a little more so what's this Medrash teaching us. Another thing I want to add is the Ramban that the Rosh Yeshiva was referring to, that the mitzvah of living in actually the technical term is Yoresh Eretz Yisrael. So if you look, the Ramban says something very interesting. The Ramban says in source number 5, he says, Ve'al tishtabesh v'tomar. So don't make a mistake and say, Ki ha-mitzvah hazos, hi ha-mitzvahs m'mechavesh shema amamim, she'yistavu la'abdam. So what would a person think? A person would think, very simple, a logical person. He'd say, listen, what's the mitzvah? Mitzvah is we got to go into Eretz Yisrael and wipe out the 7 nations. Wipe out basically all our enemies. Now, what's the natural result of wiping out your enemies? By definition, the land's yours, right? So, in doing so, the byproduct of wiping out the 7 nations will be it's Yerusha. It's now Eretz Yisrael is ours. So the Ramban says, don't think that's what it means. He says instead, he says in a davar kain. Okay, why? He says because one chiyuv is to go ahead and wipe out our enemies, the Shiva Avamim. But let's say, for example, he says, let's say vim ratzul lahashlim nashlim imohem v'na'azveim b'tanoim yiduim aval haaretz lo naniach ota b'yadam v'lo b'yad zlotam mina umot b'dor mina darat. Okay, or I'll explain what it means in a second. Or he says v'chein im baruchu ha'umot hahem mipneinu v'hachu lahem. All right, v'natayim v'chash baruchu eretz tovak artzam zo afriki. So what he's basically saying is like this. He's saying that, let's say a situation emerged where, you know what, things worked out well for the Jews. We live in Eretz Yisrael, let's pretend today, for example, okay? And let's say we meet a true peace, if such things possible, with all the enemies surrounding the Jewish state. Okay, so then what do the Jewish people say? You know what, listen, we worked it out really well, so let's, there's no wars anymore. Let's leave. We'll go we'll move to California. The economy's booming there. We'll basically ship the whole population over to California. All right. According to the Ramban says that would be a problem. That would be mivatel, the idea of Yoresh Haaretz. That would actually be a problem to do such a thing. Meaning that on the surface, it seems like we have to maintain a continued presence in the land of Israel. So the question is what's the idea? Why is the Ramban emphasizing this? And as I like to always say, the Rishonim never waste ink. And the fact that Ramban's telling us we might be confused by this notion means he's trying to tell us a very, very critical idea. So I think the idea is like this. First thing we have to understand is that, as I said before, the Medrash, going back to the Medrash is separating out the Geula from Mitzrayim, meaning that initial Geula, from the Geula Asida. So if I asked, in other words, there's something that shares in common, there's something they share in common, and yet something that makes them different. What they share in common is the notion of a Geula. Geula always means a transformative, a change, a shinoi, a distinct change in the character of the nation. When we went, for instance, from Mitzrayim, it wasn't just Abdus Lecheres, but we say V'ga'alti, that there was some sort of idea of a redemption. It's interesting, by the way, if you ever think of the term, I think I mentioned this when I spoke before Pesach, but if you ever think of the term redemption, in and of itself, redemption actually means like by pidyon, where you redeem someone. Doesn't actually, the term itself doesn't always have a spiritual quality. But anyway, we tend to learn it as having a spiritual quality to it. But the difference between the two was that the first Geula was really temporary. It was temporal. It ended, right? We went into Eretz Yisrael after Yetzias Mitzrayim. We conquered, and then eventually, through the 2 destructions of the Beis Hamikdash, we'll put both Geulas together there, the Geula Rishon and Shniya. Eventually, what happened? It was over, right? Whereas the final Geula, okay, the final redemption will be one that is permanent. It'll be a permanent state. So the real question is that why is Yerusha, all right? Why is the notion of Yerusha, of Yerusha such a necessary component of the whole process of Geula? Okay, so what I want to say is as follows, all right? And this is where the idea, what I think sovereignty comes in, okay? There's two ideas of sovereignty that being sovereign can produce. So one is an idea of power, okay? When you now control a piece of land, so you're now sovereign, and sovereignty produces a notion of a certain inherent power that people have. And in many ways, there's no question, there is some value to that. For instance, it's wonderful that the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael today have an army. An army is certainly a demonstration of power, that we have a power. Right? But I don't think that's the underlying idea of being a sovereign people. Because even if you had the greatest army in the world, there still would be something lacking. You see, what was the problem when in our first Geula? All right? So when we left Mitzrayim, what ultimately happened? What ultimately happened is that we no longer were Avadim. There's the concept of being Eved, again, through Yitzia and then eventually Kriyas Yamsuf, the whole notion of us, ourselves, our slave mentality was destroyed. What did Matan Torah do? Har Sinai took that notion and said, well, you're not just, in a sense, free as to do whatever you want. We became Ovdei Hashem. Our notion of Avdus changed from being Avadim to man to now we worship God. We were subservient to Kadosh Baruch Hu. But there's one more thing required, in my opinion. And that is Yerusha. See, Yerusha, what Yerusha does is that Yerusha, when a group of people, when a nation can control their own land, when they have dominion over the land, that refutes any notion among everyone else that they are slaves. Part of the importance of Bnei Yisrael wasn't just intrinsically demonstrating they weren't slaves, but as well as to establish the world at large that were also not slaves. And that happens through sovereignty. There's no question that one thing that bothers many of our enemies is the fact that we have control over Eretz Yisrael, which demonstrates that what? That we are people who are Yoresh. And that bothers people. It bothers them a lot to show that somehow we are a free people. But what does Yerusha ultimately do? And I want to posit what the Ramban's talking about is the idea of being sovereign. It's not just a question of power, but it's a question of a state of security. And that's the key point here, and that's what the Medrash are talking about. You see, what I mean by security is that even during the times of the initial Kibush Aretz, we wiped out, so to speak, the 7 nations, but the problem was that there were still enemies. We were surrounded by enemies. All right? It wasn't like the entire world around Eretz Yisrael said, wow, look, these Jewish people are great. Yeah, granted, during times of Shlomo Melech, there might have been a small period of time where that happened. But overall, there were still enemies. We were still surrounded by enemies. Not just militarily, which we tend to think of today, but ideologically. The fact is that the entire world was not united insofar as seeing God as Melech Elyon. That wasn't the case. There was a lack. So, as a result, there was not a complete state of security that existed among the Jewish people. There's always an awareness that there are still enemies existing. There's still a possibility that we may be attacked. And as long as that exists, as long as that possibility exists, it's sort of like, I'd say, an impediment in our ability to put our security in God. One of the objectives that we had getting out of Egypt, getting the Torah, and then finally moving to Eretz Yisrael, was that we should be able to put our security in God. We'll see this in the next piece. Our security must be placed in God. But it's difficult to do so when we have this constant fear, constant concern that no, our Geula is not complete, that we're in a state, our sovereignty is not complete, because it's always under threat. So, yes, there is an idea that sovereignty is an expression of power, but also the benefit for Klal Yisrael, the perfection that exists, is in the ability to remove insecurities, to be completely secure in our sovereignty, and then take that security and place it in Kadosh Baruch Hu. And as long as external threats exist, it's an impossibility for us to be able to do that. And we know that by living in Eretz Yisrael today, we know that we're very powerful. We've hit a certain state of power that we haven't had in thousands of years. But at the same time, we know there are constant threats that exist, constantly. We had discussed, I think the guys will back me up, for those who attended, to go on what was called an Israel advocacy trip, where we went around with someone who's, I'd say, a leader in the field, to really teach us about the concept of we don't experience as much in Modi'in, but if you really go to the borders around Eretz Yisrael, in Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Gaza, you see, and you hear from the IDF, you see that it's a constant threat. As long as that threat exists, there's something lacking in our ability to be sovereign. Yes, we have the power, but we lack security. And that's what the Medrash is alluding to. The Medrash is saying that 1/10, that there's still enemies that exist. But what happens in the times of Mashiach doesn't mean we're going to eradicate all the non-Jews. That's absurd. That doesn't mean the Jews exist alone. But it means is that there's a unity among every single person in the world to recognize God as Melech Elyon, to recognize that the ideology of Yehadus is the proper ideology, and that uniting, yes, of course, some non-Jews will, Jews also, but some non-Jews will perish, of course. That's Gog and Magog. But at the end of the day, the ultimate sovereignty will emerge. The ultimate sovereignty of a true security, where there are no ideological or military threats, where all we can do then is focus on HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that to me is the real idea of sovereignty. That's the ultimate sovereignty. So I think what the Rav was talking about, he wasn't slamming the fact that there was no idea of sovereignty. I think what he was saying is you have to recognize that yes, we do have a new sense of power, but do we have the security yet? We don't. And when we merit the Geula Sida, when we finally get to Geula, then we will have the true security that being sovereign produces. So that's what I want to posit the idea of sovereignty is. But as you'll see, it slides into the next concept of the, so to speak, the superiority of Eretz Yisrael. When you look at the Torah, when the Torah presents Eretz Yisrael, I mean, it does in many cases, but in Parshas Eikev, it's the source number 6. So it says over there, Ki Hashem Elokecha mebiyachal Eretz Tova, Eretz Nachal Imayim, Ayanos Usamos Tutzima Mekal Bahar. And of course, you know the next pasuk, Eretz Chito Sarah Geffen the Sein of Rimon, Eretz Yishem Devash, and then on and on. Basically, God describes, I don't mean to minimize it, but God describes Eretz Yisrael as basically a paradise. There's no question that that's how God describes the land of Israel and the Torah. Of course, there's a famous concept when Mark Twain visited here. He certainly didn't think that was the case. He thought the exact opposite. He saw like basically a desolate wasteland. So, but yet God presents it that way. Now, what's interesting is the next source, okay? Because it says like as follows in number 7: Ki ha'aretz asher atah b'shama l'rishta lo eretz Mitzrayim hi. Okay, and this is fascinating. So the land that you're coming to, okay, to take over, okay, to express to be sovereign, all right, it's not like Egypt. It's not like Eretz Mitzrayim. Asher yitzatem misham, asher tizra es zarcha, v'yishkisa v'raglacha k'gan ha'era. Okay, so it's not. It's unlike, okay, like Egypt. So the Torah is giving an agricultural translation, right? So it says, rather land where you're across Herod is a land of mountains and plains, but into the sky and water. A land where the eyes of Shem God are always upon from the year's beginning. All right. So Rashi's two unbelievable explanations to what this is talking about actually contradict each other. So he says as follows. He says, so what does that mean? It means Ela Tova Mimana. So Israel is better. When was this? She says, this is told Jews when they got out of Egypt, when they left. It doesn't matter exactly when, but the point the Jews left Egypt, told them you should recognize that every year to Egypt. Because they said to themselves, they said, Sheretz Tova, be themselves there. As you'll soon see, there was something unbelievable about Egypt. The Jewish, there's no way that Egypt's the best. Israel is Israel best. So, the second there, he says, what does he say? Egypt, so you have to, if the water to go ahead and irrigate your fields. He says it's a big involvement happening. He says the other one wasn't. Okay, but what happens as a result of this? So you have to interrupt your sleep. Okay, you don't get to sleep well when you live in Egypt because you have to go ahead and walk outside and go draw water up to go ahead and water your crops. All right. Okay. So what happens in Israel, in Eretz Yisrael? Baruch Hashem. It says limtar. Excuse me. It says avazu limtar shemayim tishtamayim. Right. You get to sleep in your beds. Don't worry about it. HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right. Mashkin namach v'gavah. So what happens? So when you live in Israel, you don't have to worry about it so much. God makes rain. Everything was going to work out for you, and you get to sleep very well. So, I mean, okay, so you're telling me that what makes Israel so much superior to Egypt is really an issue of the effort required to go ahead and water your crops? And I mean, in other words, if you would have said that Egypt suffers from droughts and Israel doesn't, okay, so I can see a big qualitative difference. All he's saying is that, okay, so in Egypt, you didn't sleep as well, you have to wake up, go ahead, draw water, bring it to your crops. Okay, it's an extra hour of work. But yet in Eretz Yisrael, now we have to understand, Rashi can't possibly mean that you lie in your bed and God just makes it rain and the crops grow and everything, there's no idea of harvesting crops or anything like that. That's absurd. The Torah clearly tells us that there are plenty of times where we're going to have to plant, we have to harvest, etc. So we are going to be doing labor. So if we're doing labor anyway, so So this additional step is the qualitative difference between Egypt and Israel? That's absurd. Doesn't make any sense. What is Rashi talking about? So that's the first question. And that's the easy one. Okay? The second one's much, much more difficult. So then Rashi says that this is critical. So Moshe Rabbeinu, when he says to Bnei Yisrael about the difference between the two, really says, when he says, Lo Eretz Mitzrayim he, look what Rashi says. It's not me, Rashi. Yachol b'gnusa kasa medaber. No, really, what was Moshe doing? He was denigrating Israel. He was denigrating Israel. The little pshat is that he was denigrating the land of Israel. Now, of course, as we all know, what's the punishment for denigrating Israel?
You don't get to go in.
What?
You don't get to go in.
Well, you get parsha shlach, right? Very, very bad. And yet, Rashi's clearly implying that Moshe is denigrating Israel. And what do he say? Kach amar lahem. And this is the interesting part. What does it mean, Lo Eretz Mitzrayim he? He says, Elo roa himana. Really, it's worse. How is it worse? So he quotes a Gemara, and I'll summarize the Gemara, just insofar as time is concerned. The Gemara says as follows. It says that what happened? It said that Ham, who was Noah's son, so he built the city of Tzoan for her son Mitzrayim. Okay, so again, Mitzrayim is called Mitzrayim because it's one of the sons. And what Ham did is he went ahead and built a specific city in the middle of Egypt, in the middle of Mitzrayim, for his son. Okay, and that was called Tzoan. Tzoan was the name of the city. Okay, now what did he do for Canaan? He built Hebron. Okay, Hebron was built for Canaan. So what happened? We have two cities built. One was Tzoan in the middle of Egypt. The other one was Hebron in Israel. Okay, now what does he say? He says, I'm summarizing. The Gemara says that over time, the land of Mitzrayim became the most praiseworthy of all lands. Right, all the Shevach was there, and within the most praise, Tzoan was considered the greatest of all cities. It was actually referred to as the seat of royalty. All right, I'm not interested in whether there's archaeological evidence. The point is that there's a certain point that Rashi's trying to make here. But there was some sort of city in this great country of Egypt that was a seat of Malchus, that royalty was there, which you can only imagine was, I guess, Dubai today. I guess is the best example. Some incredible Mecca that no pun intended, that existed in the center of Egypt. And what about Hebron? Okay, Hebron, which is considered, this is important, Rashi explains, based on the Gemara, that Hebron was the most inferior of all cities in Eretz Yisrael, right? Because what was its primary feature? Beis HaKvaros, a cemetery. Now, he doesn't say Maras and Machpelah. It's got to be clear. He says a Beis HaKvaros, right? A cemetery. That is the defining feature of Hebron. So he says, but nonetheless, you should know that Hebron is still superior to Tzoan. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'm Bnei Yisrael and I hear this, I'm like, really? How is it possible? Why should I be possibly convinced by your argument? You're telling me that Mitzrayim and so on are like this unbelievable paradise, and the greatest thing about this city in Israel, the greatest thing about, or actually the most identifiable feature about that city is a cemetery, and somehow that's your argument that Hebron is greater than so on, and therefore Eretz Yisrael is greater than Egypt? It's absurd. How's that possible? And how do we get out of the fact that it sounds like Moshe is denigrating, Eretz Yisrael? So I didn't copy it, but the Sisei Chachamim jumps in and says, no, don't think that Moshe was denigrating Eretz Yisrael, chas v'chalila, because again, the Meradim were killed for such a thing. But I think the way he explains it basically is, I don't want to say Moshe used sarcasm, but basically it was more like a pep talk. Basically what he was saying was that you don't have to worry about it as long as you follow the mitzvos. All right, so then the idea of Hebron will change. It'll become, you can have the so on elements, but you have to follow the mitzvahs first. So I don't want to take up the issue of whether or not how Moshe denigrated or not. What I'm more interested in is how is Hebron, knowing that Hebron has a basic kavaros, what makes that quote unquote superior to Tzoan? Right now, Tzoan sounds like a much better place to live. It sounds like it's the center of the world. Why not live in a place like Tzoan versus a place like Hebron, where its defining feature is a cemetery? Okay. So let's take Rashi's first shot and answer that one first. So it's interesting. Rashi focuses. There's one word he puts in there in this first interpretation that I think helps give us an idea of what makes Eretz Yisrael, in a sense, superior. See, he mentions, and I don't think it's a coincidence. He mentions that when you're in Egypt, so what happens? He says you lose sleep. You lose sleep. But later on, it says in Eretz Yisrael, you now. I don't think it means that you'll sleep more hours in Eretz Yisrael, but I think he means like this. You see, and we see this a lot today. I quote a pasuk from Mishlei, number 9, where it says, Ki lo yishnu im lo yareu v'nigzlo shnasam im lo yachshilu, which is a reference to evil people, right? their sleep is always stolen from them. They never actually sleep well. What does that mean? Okay, and it's not just about evil people. It's a general idea psychologically that you see when you live in it. A lot of times happens for CEOs of large companies. Okay, they don't usually a lot of times they don't sleep well. Why don't they sleep well? Why don't they sleep well? Because everything about their lives is the company, right? And you know that happens at night. I mean, we've all woken up sometime at night worried about something. Okay, that happens to all of us, I imagine, right? At some point, sometime in our lives, a couple times, big test the next day, big job you have to finish, and because you're consumed by it, what happens? You don't sleep well. Now, sometimes you have CEOs of major companies that their whole lives they don't sleep well because they're consumed. It's an all-consuming type of concept, and that's why they don't sleep. That's a very common concept of why your sleep's interrupted. Your unconscious and is in a state of conflict, and all you think about is, what am I going to do? You see it a lot also with traders. I have friends who trade in the stock market. So they used to always tell me, it's a great job because your hours are limited, right? But it's not, because you never stop thinking about trading, okay? Even when you're done trading, for the rest of the night, you're only thinking about, what am I going to do the next day? And these guys don't sleep well because it's an all-consuming concept. I think what Rashi is telling you is that in other words, one of the main ideas in Eretz Yisrael is that, and again, as I mentioned before, the Torah presents Eretz Yisrael as like a physical paradise. But if you think about it, if that were in and of itself the good, we'd have a big problem. For example, if you look back in the brachos, okay, when Yitzchak originally gave the bracha to who we thought was Esav, so that indicates tremendous, unbelievable bracha of physical good. The fruits and this and that, you'll be able to eat well, everything will be provided for you. Now, I don't want to get the whole shir about Yitzchak, but let's assume Yitzchak wasn't dumb, all right? He knew Esau's personality to some extent, but he had a certain hope. And his hope was that if someone's physical needs are satisfied, if he doesn't need to pursue the physical, what will happen? Naturally, he'll turn from that world to the world of ideas, to the world of Ideas Hashem. That will produce a natural, organic result, because he doesn't need to pursue these things anymore. Now, of course, with someone like Esav, the error there was that no, Esav would continue pursuing the physical world. He was considered being a Baal Taiva for the rest of his life. But the hope is that if you give people enough satisfaction in the physical world, they'll have that satisfaction and they'll be able to turn from the physical world and be able to focus on God. So I think that's the difference between Mitzrayim and Eretz Yisrael. It's not an agricultural phenomenon. It's saying that the idea of Mitzrayim, that type of life, is a life where a person he has to always think about his work. What am I going to do the next day? What am I? I have to make sure I get my crops watered, etc. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist in Eretz Yisrael. It does. But God, if we follow the mitzvos, okay, there's a certain hashkafa, there's a certain divine providence that we merit, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will ensure that we don't have to work as hard, that we can sleep comfortably at night, knowing that because we're following the mitzvos properly, that God will provide to some extent. Again, we also see that allusion by Shemitah as well. If we follow the mitzvos, the idea by Shemitah is that God will provide for us in the previous year prior to Shemitah to ensure that we're okay through the Shemitah year. But it's all contingent. It's all contingent on our adherence to Torah and mitzvos. That's the key thing here. If we don't have that, then we have a serious problem. So what I want to posit is that Rashi's telling you in that first shot is that it's not that, again, it's not an agricultural idea. It's really a sense of psychological security and peace, where a person doesn't have to always think about, oh my God, I got to go ahead and be consumed by my work. Rather, he can live a life where he knows that he merits a certain hashkafa. Question is, what about the second one? And this is the last point, which is very difficult. Okay, what is the idea that Hebron is superior to so on? Because it sounds like on the surface that Hebron has a cemetery. So what's the big deal? Okay, so what I'm positing as follows. You see, we have to understand what the idea of so on represents, and I want to tie this into Eretz Yisrael today and how we can grow more. You see, I don't think it's just a random thing that so on was the height of power and kingship, whereas Hebron's known for a cemetery. I don't think Rashi's saying that they're not two dissimilar things. They're somehow related. One's the flip side of the other. But how so? See, the thing's like this. When it comes to a place like so on, okay, what does so on really reflect? Like he says, it's the seat of royalty. It reflects the idea that man is consumed with power. Okay, the pinnacle of power at that time was so on. Remember, if you understand historically, Egypt was, in a sense, the center of the world. And within that center of the world, Rashi explained to us that so on was really where man's power was ultimately expressed. And he has to work hard for that. Man had to work very hard, Egyptian society had to work very hard to accomplish that objective of being at the pinnacle of power. But there's one problem that always exists when man assumes a high place in power. We've seen it many times before. And that is that that, what does he think? He thinks there's nothing greater than this. The fact that I built up this city in such a way, the fact that I've shown that I've controlled dominion and power over the whole world, he says to himself, okay, I've accomplished it all. What else can I possibly do? And the problem is that there's one thing he can never escape. There's one thing that the people and so on can never escape. And that's what's located in Hebron, the basic Kvaros. At the end of the day, all these things are fleeting. It's not true power. There's no true power in so on. It's an illusion. It's an aesthetic quality. It's beautiful. Don't get me wrong. I'm sure that if there was a Egyptian equivalent to Disney World there, kids would be flocking there. But the question is that what message does that really send? What is the ultimate idea there? The idea in so on is that it's power for the sake of power itself. But he never recognizes when he's consumed by that, man fails to see that the end, there is an end to it all. And that end is death. So ultimately, does he really have true power, which again leads to immortality? No. It always comes to an end. So of course, what does it have to do with Eretz Yisrael? So I think what Moshe was telling Bnei Yisrael is like this: the way this pasuk should be read according to this pshat is that don't treat Israel like an Egypt. Don't look at Israel like an Egypt. Lo Eretz Yisrael, meaning don't. This is not a word obviously, but don't Egyptianize Eretz Yisrael. What does that mean? It means that if you think that the greatness of the country, which the emotions will tell you that, the greatness is going to be to build big cities and to have all these great accomplishments in the physical world and to show, and in many ways, Baruch Hashem, Eretz Yisrael has accomplished that today. We are the hub of technology in the world. Tel Aviv is this beautiful, unbelievable metropolis. I mean, I guess it's beautiful. A beautiful metropolis, right? All these great skyscrapers. And man says to himself, look what we've accomplished. Look at the power. Look at the sense of accomplishment that we have. And of course, there's value to that. But if that's where he stops, if he can't go further than that and recognize that, yes, it's true we've accomplished that, but ultimately, is that the purpose of Eretz Yisrael? Is the purpose of Eretz Yisrael just for us to build big houses and show the world that we're these technologically advanced people? It can't be. Lo Eretz Mitzrayim. Don't Egyptianize the land of Israel. Don't treat it like an Egypt. Because what is the purpose of Eretz Yisrael? It's an opportunity for us to take the principles of Avos and Yiras Hashem to go ahead and use the land to help us grow as people. And through growing as people, through using the mitzvahs of Eretz Yisrael, through studying more Torah, of course we have to work. We have to, have crops, build buildings, etc. Those things are necessary without question. But always recognize that that's not the ultimate goal. If we sit and rest on our laurels and think to ourselves, look what we've accomplished up to this point, and then stop there, we've not actually inherited the true idea of Eretz Yisrael. And I think that's the one message I want to get across for Yom HaAtzmaut, which is that a large part, and one of the impetuses for the Yom Iyun, is that Yom HaAtzmaut is more than just simply a day to reflect. We should reflect. We should reflect on the incredible accomplishments that the Jews have done over the past 66 years in this country. It's unheard of. I mean, history will look back on this and say that this nation, who should have been ceased to exist by now, somehow was able to pull this off after the Holocaust, and not just pull it off. There are a lot of other nations that have attempted to, or in many ways have declared independence, and they're a mess and they're a nightmare. I don't know if anyone wants to move to South Sudan anytime soon, but South Sudan is not a very nice place to live right now. Look what the Jews have accomplished, but you can't stop there. Once you rest, if you just reflect and rest in your laurels, we're missing the true message. We must take what we've accomplished and go further and grow, not just insofar as building bigger buildings, because that just means that we're just trying to show we're more powerful. No, we have to combine Torah, bring Torah into our lives, adhere more to mitzvos, recognize that that's the ultimate purpose of Eretz Yisrael. And if we see that, then we'll merit the Geula Asida as soon as possible. So with that, I'll end, and I hope that we merit the Geula in the immediate future.